Thank you so much for staying with us here on Morning Live. And if you've just woken up, welcome to it. Now, although the South African government has been lauded for its work in dealing with the coronavirus and also sourcing funds needed to keep the country afloat, this good work can easily be undone by the risk of fraud and corruption. Now, the lack of accountability and fiscal and financial discipline poses a huge threat both to government spending and the reporting systems if there are no proactive measures put in place. Now, local government has been allocated a sum of 20 billion rand to avert hunger, to deal with unemployment, and also to provide basic services. Emergency procurement and a suspension of the so-called normal laws governing municipalities, including the Financial Management Act or the FMA, could open the system to malfeasance. Professor Mcebisi Ndletyana is an associate professor of politics at the University of Johannesburg, and he joins us now to discuss this further. Professor, good morning. Thanks for speaking to us.
Hi, good morning, Sakina.
Read the piece you wrote yesterday, and one has to ask, Professor, in a country where corruption, misappropriation of funds and fraud are not only commonplace but also endemic and systemic, how can accountability and transparency be achieved in a time of crisis beyond the allocated auditing measures?
It is a serious worry because these things happen under normal circumstances, right? So if you have suspended all normal regulations, you have suspended council meetings, obviously that poses the risk of things getting worse. But we can avert this. What other countries, for instance, have suggested is that you must have real-time auditing. So as municipalities, for instance, spend money, you must have multidisciplinary teams located at these municipalities to make sure that expenditure is audited pretty much immediately. Because you don't want to wait for completion of expenditure later on to start auditing. That might be a little bit too cumbersome. And the idea really is to prevent abuse of money and set processes in place so that people who are needy get what they're meant to get. Because if money is wasted, it's highly likely that some of the needy people might not get the money.
But is that even possible, Professor Ndletyana, given the systems that we do currently have in place, given the capacity, or perhaps we should say the lack thereof at municipal level? And of course, we've seen over the years less than 20% of our municipalities actually, bothering to submit a proper financial statement. So is that even possible?
It is possible, Sakina. Countries all over the world have learned from these instances, because normally in times of crisis, monies get stolen. This happened, for instance, in the United States during the Hurricane Katrina tragedy, and it happened with the Ebola outbreak. So the world has learned lessons. They have devised ways of preempting these things from happening. The main reason that these monies were stolen previously was because people suspected that in times of crisis, in times of human tragedy, you would not have thieves. You thought that thieves had a conscience, so they would not steal money intended for the vulnerable and the needy. But it so happened that they did. So those are lessons that the world is beginning to put into place. And in South Africa, if we do that as well, there's a high possibility that we will prevent abuse of money. But the concern in South Africa, unlike other countries, is that auditing has become a dangerous preoccupation because auditors in the last few years have been chased away, threatened with death from municipalities, threatened by officials and councillors who are potentially corrupt, and fear that having auditors there looking through the books, they might be discovered and therefore go to jail. So some of them have been threatened with death, have been chased away. So what you might need, which would be a very odd situation, is that the auditors, some of these soldiers that have been sent to all sorts of areas, might have to be stationed at municipalities to make sure that auditors are able to do their job. That's how terrible things are, that auditors have to be threatened with death. So my point, therefore, is that the measures that have been proposed can work. Experience has taught the rest of the world that these things are necessary and if implemented can prevent corruption. But in our case, the concern is, can you provide sufficient protection for auditors?
And again, going back to the question of endemic and systemic corruption, Professor. We look at the water situation, for example. Communities who haven't had water for years, or where water supply has been deliberately disrupted in order to actually facilitate corruption, because if you then have tankers brought in to provide the water, there's someone who's making money off that. So there's an incentive to send out the tankers as opposed to maintaining the infrastructure that would deliver water directly to people. So if you try to basically disrupt that system as well, it could also be deadly.
It could be quite deadly. But you see, Sakina, what these things tell us is that we need to reform our system. What has happened in the last 20 or so years is that a lot of power has been concentrated to councillors and councils. For instance, if there is suspicion of corruption, only a council can vote to institute an investigation. And if they do go ahead to set up that investigation, for instance, and a report comes back, they can keep that report and not table it. And if they don't table the report, it means the report is not public. You and I can never know of that report. So there is much power concentrated in the councillors. What we need to do is to protect the system against malfeasance. You look, for instance, in the appointment of managers and city managers. These folks are largely appointed by councillors. You don't have an independent system. Previously, we had the Public Service Commission had the powers to appoint bureaucrats. And the Public Service Commission itself was constituted of, experts who supposedly took independent decisions. But because these institutions, when 94 happened, were mostly made up of old Afrikaner folks, so there was concern that they might be resistant to appointing black people. And also not many black people had the expertise that were required for local government. So they then relocated those powers away from these institutions into politicians. That is why, for instance, the Public Service Administration Department was set up to take over the powers of the previous Public Service Commission. And that department is obviously a political department, so it appointed people not so much according to stringent criteria, merit criteria, but we understand what was the cause of that. But over the years, these appointments have been abused to appoint people who are not qualified. So what we need to do as part of reforming local government, we need to realize that times have changed. Mechanisms and measures that we instituted at the beginning of our democratic order, for good reasons, no longer work now. They have become abused, right? So we need to adapt to the changed circumstances. And in fact, this is what the National Development Plan says. We need to prioritize meritocracy. So these appointments need to be taken away from the hands of politicians or out of the influence of politicians to independent, merit-based institutions. So these things, Sakina, are happening because they're allowed by institutions. Most people say, why is it that public servants, for instance, don't seem to be ethical, don't have a conscience? I'm saying for desperate people at times, if they can steal money, if the institutions allow them to, most people are good, Sakina, but they get into tough times and find a reason to steal. And unfortunately, in our case, or unfortunately, the systems are not tight against theft. Because even now, the AG, for instance, knows which municipalities where councillors and officials have companies that have gotten contracts. They know that. Last year it was almost R1 billion, right? But you haven't had an investigation. There is no investigation into those municipalities where millions and millions of money were given to councillors and councils who have contracts or who have companies. That's clearly a conflict of interest, right? So we need to give more power to institutions such as the AG, to the bureaucracy, to invite, unfortunately, the judiciary, to propose even more measures to ensure that these institutions are strengthened and there is prosecution. There's impunity in the public service. That's the problem. That is why you would have lack of performance, for instance. About 62 to 70% of municipalities would not follow up any allegations of fraud, for instance. And the AG has these reports. They would tell you 70% of these municipalities, and they would name them, right? They've heard suspicion allegation of fraud and theft and this and that, and those municipalities would not follow up those allegations. There would be no investigation. So there is no consequence management. There is no investigation. We know who stole money, but those people are not followed. So the system promotes impunity. So we shouldn't be sitting here, you and I, Sakina, and fake surprise. We know we operate within a system that encourages impunity. You fix the system, then you are able to crowd out malfeasance.
So speaking to that system, Professor, if law enforcement institutions have failed to this point to decisively hold corrupt government officials to account during times of normality, what are the chances of things being done differently now?
If you bring the AG's office into these municipalities, and you also identify, malfeasant or municipalities that are prone to wrongdoing, because you have those. You can just go back, read the reports, identify those who are likely to do this, then assign AG and staff and have them protected by the by the police. Then you are likely to detect this. But most importantly, obviously, the AG had the legislation that governs the functions of the AG has been revised lately to enable the AG to institute criminal charges against those who are suspected or those who have taken wrongful decisions that led to wastage of money. I'm not sure if that legislation has been implemented yet. It is something perhaps that one might want to follow up with the AG's office. But what we need to do is to provide enough personnel. The issue is personnel, Sakina. And if you have that personnel station, as I said earlier, doing real-time investigation, and at least now, because you'll have the team station there, and you've had sufficient noise, like you and I are making now, good intelligent noise though, that everyone is watching. Possibly those who had intentions to steal might pull back. They have started stealing, by the way. They've been stealing food. But fortunately, this kind of attention and the measures that will be instituted might just restrain them.
Well, Professor, could talk so much more, but we're out of time. Thanks so much for speaking to us this morning, Professor Mcebisi Ndletyana, who is an Associate Professor of Politics at the University of Johannesburg. And we're talking about why government should be laying out clear guidelines on how the 20 billion rand, especially that is earmarked for municipalities, will be disbursed to avoid misappropriation. Let's take a quick break.